Dear brother, I'm very happy to be with you today. Really, it
Well,
means
thank
a
you,
lot.
Thomas. It's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you. It means a lot. And for everyone, Mike Lykona for me is not only a teacher, but a teacher, a professor, a big brother before everything. And I cannot describe how much he's supporting me. Mike Lykona is the professor in Baptist Austin University, and he is specialized in Jesus' resurrection and crucifixion historicity, and this is why we are thinking of taking this with him as a first draft, because we know that we will learn a lot from you, Mike.
Well, thanks, Thomas. It's wonderful to join you.
Thank you. First of all, Mike, let me start it a little bit easy. One of the questions that I felt a little bit personal, what makes Mike a believer? What makes Mike someone who really confident in his faith?
Well, since I was very young, I don't remember what age, but I'm going to guess it was around 7 or 8 years old. I can remember asking my mom, how do I get to heaven? And she'd say, well, you just have to do more good than bad. And I said, well, okay. I know I'd pulled my sister's hair, I'd hit her, I'd made her cry. And I'd say, what if I do more bad than good? And she said, well, then you go to be with the devil in hell forever. And I'm thinking, well, where am I in that mix? So when I was 10 years old, this Christian magician came to our church, and they combined all the Sunday school classes together. And he would do these magic tricks, these illusions, whatever you want to call them. But he would relate the gospel message of Jesus to them. And for the first time, Thomas, I understood that it wasn't anything that I did that earned my way to heaven, because the bad that I did would keep me from heaven. It was what Jesus did for me in dying and rising from the dead, and that by becoming his follower, I could have eternal life. And he gave an invitation. And I remember I went forward, and I remember two girls went forward. There were 3 of us. And I was thinking, this is exactly what the kind of answer I've been looking for. And so I think that's the day I became a true Christian. Now, of course, I was 10 at that time. And, my thought processes weren't really developed at that point. Yeah. So by the time I'm in graduate school in my early 20s, I'm beginning to ask difficult questions, tough questions. How do I know Christianity is really true? I became a follower of Jesus when I was 10, and I believe I've got a good relationship with the Lord. At that point, I was praying probably an average of 1 to 2 hours a day, and I was reading the scriptures probably 2 hours a day. And so I was really committed and into it, and I was enjoying it. It wasn't work for me. It was easy. If I prayed an hour a day, it just went by so fast.
Amazing.
And of course, you know this as a married guy. When you're single, you have a lot more time on your hands, right? So I began to question whether Christianity is true, and that's when I started to look at the evidence. I looked at the evidence for Islam. I looked at the evidence for Hinduism, Buddhism. I considered the major arguments for atheism, and I looked at the evidence for the truth of Christianity. And it was primarily the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus that really confirmed that what I had began to follow at age 10 was indeed the truth. And I was willing to give up my faith because I didn't want to follow a false religion and devote my life to it. So, later on, even after that time, when I was in grad school, I had bouts of doubt when I would begin to doubt my Christian faith even more. And I would ask the tough questions. How do I know this is true? And maybe I'm looking at the evidence and I'm biased. And of course I'm biased. Everybody's biased. Muslims are biased. Atheists are biased. Doesn't matter what you believe, you're biased. But how do I overcome that bias and look at this objectively? And I need to do this because it could mean the eternal destiny of my soul. And so I and other Christians, many of us have been brought up as Christians. Many Muslims have been brought up as Muslims, the same as for Hindus and Buddhists. And so, it's tough to overcome a worldview in which you've been raised. So I wanted to give it a real, honest investigation. And so I did a PhD research in it. I did six years. Well, actually 5.5 years of intensive research. That was on top of the 4 years or more of research that I had already done on it. So, I mean, there's over 10 years of research that I've done in this, but 6 years of heart-wrenching, trying to be as honest as possible research and willing to give up my faith. And in the end, I still believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I think it's by far the best historical explanation of the data. So the short answer to your question, Thomas, I became a Christian because the gospel message I had heard at age 10 made sense to me. But I am still a Christian today because the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus I find very compelling, more compelling than any other alternate explanation or worldview.
Amen. As I told you, I would like today to be a little bit the naggy bad boy in the event. So let me tell you a little bit. I got scared when you said that because it made me feel that do I need all these years to be sure that Christianity is true? Because in my country, for example, in Egypt, people are tired mostly. We have this wave of, we are tired of religion. We are tired of the fights on which one is true and everyone is saying we are right. So do you think it needs 10 years to know that we are right? I mean, it's scary.
That's a fair question. It is, Thomas. All I can say is all of us are wired differently. Okay. I've run into people who years ago, I bumped into, I was friends with a physician. It was a woman and she's in the military and she was really seeking and she was looking at evidence. But she felt that she was more inclined to relate to the message if it was given in a very formal setting, a kind of church where there's stained glass windows and the liturgy and a high church setting. I'm thinking, well, why? Why do you need that? We all have different, I don't know if you've read the book, The 5 Love Languages.
Yes.
It's a great book to understand your spouse and to understand marriage and how we're loved, how we feel loved, and why a lot of times we're trying to communicate love to our spouse, but it just isn't working. There are different ways that we like to be loved. And my wife likes to be loved in a different way than I like to be loved. And so it's understanding your spouse's love language and communicating love in that manner. I think truth languages, you could say, is the same. So for some, they want tradition. For some, a lot of people, they want to know about experience. Does this work for you? How does it make you feel? Does it give you peace? For me, no, I don't need that. I just want the facts. So at another time, I was talking to a physician who was an allergist, and he said, yeah, I go to a Unitarian church where, they let us find what we want to believe, what makes sense to us. And we find peace in that. And I said, well, that's great if all you're looking for is peace on the earth and during this life. But if you're looking for peace in an afterlife, that's not going to work. Suppose I came in and I just wanted your opinion as an allergist and you're an expert and you gave me your opinion. You said, well, you're allergic to this. And so I went to a couple of other people, my next door neighbor who has no medical training, and another one who's maybe a physical therapist, and another one who's my sister, and say, well, what do you think? And they give me different opinions. I wouldn't, what if I said to that physician, it's just a matter of opinion, right? It's whatever I find to be satisfying. And you say I'm allergic to this, but some of them said I'm not allergic. So I'm just going to go with them because it makes me feel better. I said, you would think I'm crazy about to do something like that. Well, it's the same thing about worldviews. I care about facts, not what makes me feel good. I want to know what's true because it could mean the eternal destiny of my soul. So the bottom line, I guess, Thomas, is truth, we receive it differently. And for most Christians, most Christians don't need evidence because they sense the Holy Spirit that's leading them in that direction and confirming. I mean, it's like Paul says, the Spirit itself bears witness with our witness that we are children of God. And for most Christians, that's enough. We know deep down inside that Christianity is true because the Holy Spirit bears witness of it. But for some of us, it's like, well, how do I know that's the Holy Spirit talking to me? Yeah. I want confirmation from facts. And so I look for facts, and I don't expect 100% verification because we don't get that for anything in life. I'm looking for the most probable explanation. But again, for most Christians, they don't need it. For me, I needed it.
Amen. Actually, this led me to a statement that I actually got to my mind after hearing you now. And I wonder if you agree on it. There's a statement that says that I accepted Christianity because of evidence, but I continued as a believer because experiencing God himself. What do you think that this is describe what you were saying in a way?
I believe, Thomas, I feel that I have experienced God at a number of times. Not that I do it on a daily, that I feel like I experience him on a daily basis. In fact, most of the time when I'm praying, it's just dry. It just feels like nobody's on the other end listening to me. That's where faith comes in. But there have been numerous times in my life as a Christian, 50 years, where I have sensed the presence of God and that he's truly listening, or that he is truly speaking to me at a particular time and has revealed something to me that it's like, wow, I just knew this was God speaking to me. It wasn't an audible voice, but it's almost as though it was just as clear as an audible voice.
Like you have no doubt. It's
there's no doubt that I felt God was communicating with me at that point. So so I can say that those experiences have been good. They've been positive, but at the end of the day, for me, it is like the historical evidence for Jesus and his resurrection that really seals the deal for me.
Actually, this is amazing because, as you know, in our Arab world, where actually we are trying to present this discussion, we have a big problem because we live under pressure all the time. Christians live under pressure all the time. They live under this mood of defense. Every second, someone is questioning Jesus, crucifixion, divinity, and resurrection, 24/7. And this made it a little bit harsh for our Christian youth in the Arab world, because they feel that they are not sure anymore. And the church was not that well equipped all the time to do that because they were busy with other stuff to maintain life. And from here, I want to take you to my background. You know where I came from well, and you know how I suffered with that. And I receive myself this question a lot. They say, do you think that really we have enough evidence for the crucifixion? Because we are not sure that the Bible is saying the truth. And we are worried that the Bible is not countable. And their word before our word. And it's this for that. Quran is saying this, Christianity is saying that. Who knows? So,
Yeah.
do you think
yeah,
so?
for the crucifixion of Jesus and his death by crucifixion, I can say a few things. So first, the evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion, the historical evidence, is very strong. So strong that even atheist New Testament scholars, those who reject the existence of any kind of a personal creator, God of the universe, they think that the death of Jesus by crucifixion in the first century is one of the best attested facts of the ancient world. So I cite someone like John Dominic Crossan and Gert Ludemann, atheist New Testament scholars. Well, Crossan doesn't like to be referred to as an atheist, but he has said that he does not believe in a personal creator of the universe. There's no personal being who created the universe in Crossan's mind. So, I call that an atheist. He can call it what he wants. But there's plenty of critical or skeptical New Testament scholars who reject the existence of God, who reject the resurrection of Jesus, but they'll still say the death of Jesus by crucifixion is one of the best attested facts in the ancient world. Why? Well, you have early sources like the oral tradition preserved in 1 Corinthians 15 that talks about Jesus' death. You have Paul mentions it in his letters. You have it in the Gospels. All of this that I'm mentioning is written within 65 years of the death of Jesus. You've got Josephus, a Jewish historian, non-Christian, so he's unsympathetic to the Christian cause. And he mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And although it is true that is a disputed passage in terms of whether Josephus said everything in that text, that is in the current Greek text of that. The overwhelming abundance of Josephus specialists today will say that Josephus certainly mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion by Pontius Pilate in there at minimum. You have Tacitus, the Roman historian, one of the finest, perhaps the finest Roman historian, writing in the early part of the 2nd century. He mentions Jesus' execution by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. You have Lucian of Samosata. He was hostile to the Christian faith, writing around the year 150, so maybe 120 years or so after Jesus' death. He mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion in Palestine. You have Mara Serapion, a Jewish prisoner facing execution sometime either in the latter part of the 1st century or sometime in the 2nd century. We can't narrow the date more than that. And he mentions Jesus's execution at the instigation of the Jewish leadership. The chances of surviving crucifixion are very small. So number one, our documentary evidence is very strong that Jesus died by crucifixion. The chances of surviving crucifixion, number two, are very small. So of all the reports of crucifixions in antiquity, there are only 2 instances reported of a person surviving. One is in Herodotus. We don't know much about that one at all. Doesn't really give any details, but the person was removed intentionally in order so that they might survive. The same thing in Josephus. He saw 3 of his friends crucified during the Jewish war. So he went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and asked a favor that he'd spare their lives. Titus, out of friendship to Josephus, granted their lives. And so all 3 were removed and provided the best medical care available to them at that time. In spite of that, 2 of the 3 still died. So here's the thing. Even if Jesus was removed from the cross intentionally and provided great medical care, his chances of survival were still small. But there is no evidence whatsoever that Jesus was removed while alive or provided any medical care whatsoever, much less Rome's best. So while historians can look at possibilities, historians are bound to go with probabilities. And given all the evidence we have for Jesus's death by crucifixion, without sufficient evidence to the contrary, the historian, that's at least as good. The historian must conclude that Jesus was crucified and the process killed him. Now, the only real evidence we have that Jesus survived crucifixion, a Muslim would say, would be the Quran, which was written 600 or more years after Jesus. Okay, 600 or more years after. Now, are you going to go with Gospels that are rooted, at least, in eyewitness testimony? At minimum, at minimum, Mark and John. At the very minimum, scholars, the majority of critical New Testament scholars agree that Mark and John are rooted in eyewitness testimony. That means that if they're not written by eyewitnesses, Mark wasn't, of course, but John may have been by the beloved disciple, even if that wasn't John, the son of Zebedee. But critical New Testament scholars would say if John was not written by the beloved disciple served as the author's source for the majority of that gospel. And also the majority of critical New Testament scholars think that Mark's primary source was the Apostle Peter. So both are rooted in eyewitness testimony. John was written no more than 65 years after Jesus' death. Mark was written somewhere between 20 and 40 years after Jesus' death. Are you going to go with two sources rooted in eyewitness testimony, plus Paul, who's writing even earlier? Or are you going to go with a book that was written 600 years later? You can understand why historians do not use the Quran. Now, here's one more thing. The claim of Muslims that Jesus survived crucifixion is actually problematic for Muslims. And here's why. We know historically that Jesus' disciples truly believed that he rose from the dead and had appeared to them. That's undisputed. 100% of critical scholars writing on the subject agree. Okay. So if Jesus did not rise from the dead, okay, and let's say the Quran is correct, that God took him up and just made it appear that he died by crucifixion. And it just made it appear that way, and he took him up to heaven. Well, why would he allow his disciples, Jesus' disciples, whom the Quran refers to as Muslims, why would God allow them to believe a lie? We can understand why God would deceive the Jewish leaders who had Jesus crucified and the Romans who carried out the task. We can understand why God might deceive them. But why deceive Jesus' disciples who were called Muslims in the Quran? And then allow the largest, most influential religion in the world today, and has been this way for a while. Why allow the largest religion in the world and the greatest competitor to Islam? Why allow that to exist when God could have just set the record straight? It seems that wouldn't have been very smart of God to do that. And also you look at it and say, well, if God deceived Jesus' followers, his disciples, whom the Quran refers to as Muslims, then how do you, as Muslims out there, how do you know God isn't deceiving you today? It seems to me there's no way to know that he's not. So it seems that is just a really difficult problem for Muslims. And also, I guess I'll throw in one other thing. I'm sorry I'm just going on so long with this.
No, we are enjoying.
We can show historically that Jesus predicted his imminent death and resurrection. Okay, but certainly his imminent death. So if you want to see this, go to my YouTube channel and type in crucifixion, but spell it like Ahmadidat did. Crucifiction. And you'll see a short video. It's about 5 minutes where I talk about Jesus' predictions about his death, his imminent death. We can show historically that Jesus actually did this. So here's the problem. If Jesus actually predicted his imminent death, and he said the scriptures must be fulfilled, this is why I've got to die in the very near future, he says. So he's prophesying, he's teaching, he's prophesying. So if he didn't die, that means he's a false prophet. But the Quran refers to him as a great prophet. So if Jesus did not die in imminent death, then the Quran is mistaken that he's a great prophet. But if Jesus died in imminent death, as the historical evidence all seems to indicate, then the Quran is mistaken there, because the Quran says he didn't in Surah 4. So either way, the Quran is mistaken in that. So there's just multiple problems for the Muslim when it comes to the death of Jesus. But the evidence is overwhelming that Jesus did die by crucifixion in the first century.
Actually, what you say is amazing, and it's amazing that we have this plenty of evidence. I said I will play the bad guy, so as you have this plenty of evidence, but still, among all what you said, I started to have some questions here and there. So I will start from the end, because this is very important, especially that most of our audience are either with problems under pressure of Islamic questions, or they are Muslims themselves. I'm sure that many Muslims will be watching this episode. So the thing is, in tafsir, they say that actually after Jesus rising up, and after he ascended, Christians became, or followers of Jesus became onto three types of sectors, which is a little bit funny, but I need to play the game till the end. First, they said that there were a group of Muslims. Second, a group called the Jacobians, the Jacobs, and Nestorians, which is too early to be there, but Nestorians. But then the Nestorians and the Jacobians, they did not like the Muslims, so they killed them. And that's why it was hidden till Muhammad appeared after 600 years. So do you think that as a scholar in history, can you look for something like that as even as an evidence? Can you call it as anything?
Well, no, I'd say no, because that evidence is going to be very late, right? At least 600 years after Jesus. So you've got the apostles out there, those who had walked with Jesus. Then you have Paul, who says that he knew the apostles and that they had certified that he's teaching the same thing they're teaching in terms of the gospel message. But it's not just Paul. Then you've got a guy named Clement of Rome, who probably knew the apostle Peter and later became a leader, a bishop in Rome. So when I say bishop, he's like a pastor over pastors in the city of Rome. There were various bishops in different cities. So he's a bishop, he becomes a bishop in Rome, but he had known the apostle Peter, and he's verifying stuff about the resurrection that he had no doubt heard from Peter and perhaps other apostles. You've got a guy named Polycarp who knew the apostle John. And he talks about how the resurrection of Jesus. So who's he getting this from? Well, the apostle John, because Polycarp wasn't an eyewitness. So you've got these, and then you've got Irenaeus later on in the 2nd century between the years 174 and 189. And he says that he had actually met Polycarp and heard from him. So, in order to say this kind of, hypothesis that from the Nestorians and the Jacobians that they killed the apostles, who actually knew Jesus and spread a false report. I mean, that just goes against the data. Yeah. You can make up anything you want 600 years later, but I want to see the evidence for it. Give me 1st century or 2nd century evidence. The evidence we have is that these apostles continued out there proclaiming Christ publicly for several decades, at least 2.5 decades after Jesus' death, and that Mark and John, at minimum, are rooted in eyewitness testimony. And in fact, Craig Keener has shown that the majority of critical scholars also hold today that the Gospel of Luke is rooted closely in eyewitness testimony.
Mm.
So, I mean, there's just so much to go against that, historically speaking.
That's amazing. And on the other side of the page, the Muslims still trying to pressure back, I mean, to push back, all this amount of evidence. And the most recent, or not the most recent, actually, they say this for a long time now, but the most popular argument that they try to say now, especially in the West, where they try to convince with another type of Islam, the most popular argument there that, okay, Jesus got crucified. All these eyewitnesses are right, actually, but he was not really dead. He was he fainted. He was something like that. And then when he appeared to the people they thought that he was dead. And then he resurrected. What's your comment on that? And connecting that to the evidence of the Shroud of Toronto, Torino, sorry. What do you think of this connection and this proclamation?
Well, let me ask you this, Thomas. When they're saying that Jesus didn't die, he just kind of fainted, and they took him off the cross alive, are they saying that he came back, to full health naturally or by the power of God?
No, but the power of God.
Okay,
as far as I know.
So, to that, I would say you still have some of the same problems that I mentioned earlier. So, for example, why is it that God allowed the disciples to be deceived and to form the largest religion, a religion that continues to be the most influential one in the world today? It doesn't seem that would be very smart of God. And if God allowed the disciples of Jesus to be deceived, then how do you know he's not allowing you as Muslims to be deceived today, right? So you have those as problems there. Plus, again, Jesus predicted his imminent death. So if he didn't die, then the Quran is mistaken that he was a great prophet. He would have been a false prophet.
And what do you think of the evidence of Torino? Do you think that it's accountable? Do you think that we can have any clue from there that it really happened? Or you doubt that? Because this was one of the also popular questions we received.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the Shroud of Turin, but I'll tell you a short little story. Nabil Qureshi was a friend of mine. Many people have heard of him. He was an Ahmadi Muslim. And I understand that that's not a standard Muslim. That's a lot like what maybe Mormons are like to standard Christians today. But he brought his dad over because he thought his dad was just brilliant. And I love his dad. I've met his dad. He's a great guy. He really is. And I remember Nabil saying, my dad will be able to answer Gary on the resurrection of Jesus. And they came over to my house on a Sunday afternoon, a day before Labor Day here in the United States, but this was years ago. And I remember the first thing that Nabil's dad said. He was talking to Gary Habermas because Gary and I were there. Gary and his wife Eileen were up for the week to spend a week with us. And Gary is an expert on the Shroud of Turin. And Nabil's dad said, Gary, I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead because you have the Shroud of Turin. And he said, I believe that's the burial cloth of Jesus, and corpses do not leave prints like that on a shroud. And I interjected in quickly. I said, well, neither do live bodies. And then Gary went on to say, let me give you several reasons why the man in the Shroud of Turin, since you believe it's authentic, let me give you several reasons why we can know he was dead. And he said, you got rigor mortis had set in, just we can tell from the way the body was at the time in the shroud. He said you have post-mortem blood flow, and you got this and this and this. And it's like Nabil's dad had no idea what to say because, here Gary was an expert in it. So yeah, you've got these kinds of things, more things that have come to light in more recent years, such as you can actually see the teeth in it. But, these only show up in the kind of x-rays that dentists have come to have over the last 20 years. Before that, they didn't even have these kinds of things. So you can see like an x-ray of the teeth. You've got pollen around the head that from plants that would be the crown of thorn plants. They blossom in Jerusalem around that time of the year, that certain time of the year when the crucifixion of Jesus was meant to take place. Remember, this stuff dates back on the shroud. The pollen and dirt and things like that can be dated back to the 1st century or very early. In other words, even if you took the carbon-14 dating that dates it back to, 13th or 14th century, 12th or 13th century, they didn't have the kind of forensic equipment that we have today. So it's not like you would put pollen on it knowing that someone's going to do this kind of test and find the pollen from the crown of thorns on there, or the kind of clay, dirt that was on the bottom of the feet, that's the kind of things that you would find in tombs in Jerusalem. So you got all this kind of stuff that is going on in the shroud. That's like, wow, that's pretty interesting. Well, then when this was done in 1978, I believe, when the Shroud of Turin research project got permission from the Catholic Church to do scientific analyses of it, these scientists thought they were just going to go in and very quickly be able to determine that it was a forgery. But after several weeks, they left having no idea whatsoever on how the shroud was made. No naturalistic explanations, no kind of technology that we have today that could reproduce it. We still really can't reproduce it in the same way. And then 1988 came around and they did carbon-14 testing. I remember seeing the guy who invented carbon-14 testing, an atheist physicist. I remember seeing him on a video saying he was confident that the carbon-14 testing that dated it to like the 12th or 13th century, that it was accurate. But he said, it's possible it wasn't, because the polymers that would build up on the shroud over all the years of being handled could certainly skew the date on it. So that's one problem. But then David Beck and I, we co-authored or co-edited a Festschrift for Gary Habermas. That's a book that's written to honor someone, a scholar toward the end of their career, academic career. And in there, we have 2 articles, 2 essays on the Shroud of Turin. And both of them are excellent. Mark Foreman, who's a Christian philosopher. And then there's another one by Barry Schwartz, who is an agnostic Jewish official photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project.
Wow.
And he gives a debunking of the carbon-14 testing that is absolutely devastating. And it's a brand new refutation of it, given new evidence that has come to light. So you can just throw out the 1988 carbon-14 testing, and now we're left with still the evidence for the Shroud of Turin, that it is the authentic burial cloth of someone from the 1st century, probably. And it fits all the description of a crucified victim. Now, here's the thing. If it is the authentic shroud, burial cloth of Jesus, we actually have a photograph of the resurrection, as Gary Habermas has said.
Oh, yeah. I believe that the more we go with technology, as you say, the more we describe or we found that it is just getting confirmed more and more in a hilarious way, actually. And this takes us again to a lot of other parts. For example, the most question we received is, do you think that we have only Christian accounts for the resurrection? Okay, let's say the cross happened, Jesus died. And now you say something harder, actually. Not that a man died, you're saying that he resurrected. And yeah, you already quoted some Christian sources, which for them, it will happen. Can we prove that two things here? Can we prove that this Christian sources is countable, not biased, not affected? And the second question would be, do we have any also non-Christian evidence for the resurrection?
Well, the gospel authors, the Christian, the authors who wrote the literature that are now in the New Testament, and even some of the literature outside of the New Testament, like Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius, Papias, and others, yeah, they're all biased as Christians. And do you think that Muhammad was not biased when he gave the stuff about the Quran? Of course he was. Do you think the Abu Bakr was biased? Well, of course he was, right?
Yes.
But bias doesn't make you wrong. Otherwise, here in the United States, African Americans were discriminated against for many years and treated horribly. And then you had the civil rights movement here in the United States in the 1960s, which gave a lot more rights to Blacks here in the United States. It was a good thing. Are we to say that a Black historian in the United States should not write a history of the civil rights movement here because he's Black and would be biased? Well, of course not. He'd be the very best kind of person to write on it. Or what about a Jewish historian writing on the Holocaust? They'd be the very best person writing on it. So just because a person is biased doesn't mean they're wrong, or else you have to rule out the Quran. You'd have to rule out the Sirat Rasulullah. You'd have to rule out all the ahadith because their authors were biased, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, so that's that. Now, the second half of the question the second question you asked was, do we have any non-Christians who mentioned the resurrection of Jesus? Well, you could say Paul, right? Because he was a non-Christian at the time when Jesus appeared to him. You say, well, yeah, but he was a Christian when he was writing. Yeah, but what would you think of someone who said, Jesus rose from the dead and I'm not a Christian? You would think such a person was a fool. And would you want to believe the testimony of a fool? So, what are you actually looking for here? Now, we do have, I think, Tacitus, who writes something that is consistent with the resurrection of Jesus. So in his Annals of Rome, book 15, section 44, he talks about how Pontius Pilate had Jesus executed by the most extreme penalty, which would have been crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And then he even says that Christianity was an evil and a superstition. So Tacitus isn't biased for Christians. He's biased against the Christian movement. And he says that after Jesus was crucified or executed by Pilate, he says Christianity was then checked for the moment. And then it broke out in Judea where the evil started and then spread throughout the entire world, even to the capital, Rome. Now think about this. What do the Gospels in the book of Acts tell us? Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, which is in Judea, just like Washington, D.C. is in the United States, right?
Yes.
Or Atlanta is in Georgia. Houston is in Texas. Cairo is in Egypt. So Jerusalem's in Judea. And he says Christianity was thus checked for the moment. And then it broke out again in Judea where it started. So, and then spread throughout the world. What does the book of Acts tell us? And the Gospels? It tells us, the Gospels inform us that Jesus' disciples went into hiding after his crucifixion. And the book of Acts tells us that Jesus told his disciples to be in Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit came upon them, which was at Pentecost, 50 days after Passover. And so Christianity, you could say, was thus checked. The Christian movement was checked for the moment. Nothing was happening. It was put in check. Nothing was happening.
Yes.
And then it broke out again in Judea where it started. That's where Jesus taught. That's where he preached. Just like Muhammad never went outside of Saudi Arabia, Jesus never went outside of Judea. He was in, and Galilee is part of Judea. So here he is. He's in Judea where it started, and then it spread throughout the world. What did Jesus tell his disciples at the end, at the Great Commission in Matthew, and also in Acts chapter 1, to go out and make disciples of all nations, and to go to Judea, Samaria, and even to the uttermost parts of the world. What Tacitus is reporting is consistent with what the book of Acts says that they actually did and carried out. One other verse really quickly is in Josephus. Now, it is part of the disputed portion of the text. Most Josephus scholars say that after Pilate crucified Jesus, that said the tribe of Christians did not, or his followers did not leave him at that time, but they continued in following Jesus, even though, he would have been dead, and the tribe of Christians remained to this day. But I think there's good reason to think, and a number of scholars hold this as well, just not the majority, that what Josephus actually said there was that after Jesus was crucified, his disciples reported that he appeared alive to them, and the tribe of Christians remained to this very day. And that makes more sense to me, since Josephus himself tells us that he was born in Jerusalem just a few years after Jesus, because he says when he was born, not after. He doesn't say after Jesus, but the way he explains the timing of his birth places him somewhere between 4 to 7 years after Jesus. He's born in the year 37. And his dad was Matthias, a popular Jewish priest in Jerusalem. So Josephus is growing up in the very city where Jesus' disciples, we know they're out proclaiming the death and resurrection of Jesus. And if the book of Acts is correct, a number of Jewish priests are becoming Christians, following Jesus. So Josephus and his dad would have known about this stuff and what was going on. Josephus didn't have to believe Jesus rose from the dead, but he would have certainly heard from the apostles and Christians at the time that it was being claimed that Jesus rose and had appeared to them. So for Josephus to say they reported that he rose and appeared to them would have been nothing. That's entirely plausible. And that's more in lines with the textual evidence than to leave it out.
I would like to ask you here a very important question. One atheist Christian, Egyptian Christian before, he was Christian and then grew up like a Christian, then he became atheist. He tried to get this proclamation that Josephus was bribed from the Romans. Do you think that this is possible?
Well, he was at that point a friend and employed by the Romans.
Yes.
He was a friend of Titus
Yes.
first, and then Titus's, and then you had the Roman Emperor Vespasian, and he was a court historian for Vespasian. But I hear there's this rumor or theory that's going around now that's saying that Josephus is making this stuff up for the Romans, and that's just ridiculous. There's not a scrap of evidence for that. Anyone who believes that really is just showing that they don't care about history. They don't care about evidence. Look at the evidence. What's the evidence that this was going on? You can make up anything you want. Why not just say, well, Josephus was being pressured by an alien who had come into his family from outer space and saying, you do this to deceive the Christians, or else we're going to take you back to our planet and torture you, something like that. Why not just come up with some silly explanation for that? Let's look at the evidence and go with the evidence. That's what historians do.
And I think also, Mike, that it became so popular the more God bless me to be in the circle of scholars like you and others, that the talks inside these circles are very different from the talks outside it. In the among the normal talks, you hear a lot of things that nobody dare to say it inside these circles of scholars.
Thomas, we can't help that. I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard that on Facebook, there's a group of tens of thousands, at least tens of thousands of people who think that the earth is flat.
Yeah.
All right. We can't help that. Look, they just don't take part in adult discussions. And there's just nothing that you can really do when a person is like that and they go for these conspiracy theories and they don't care about evidence. There's really nothing that you can do in terms of having a reasonable conversation with such a person. So if they're going to go for that kind of stuff, you still have Romans who are out persecuting Christians up until sometime in the 4th century, when Constantine comes along. But until then, they're out persecuting Christians and killing them in brutal ways. Pliny the Younger, just after the beginning of the 2nd century, wrote letters to the various Roman emperors at that time, telling him how he's back and forth. And in one letter, he says how he's persecuting Christians door to door, going and asking if they're Christians and telling them, if you don't deny Jesus, curse Christ, and swear your allegiance to the emperor, we're going to haul you off right now and kill you. And he talks about how he tortured 2 Christian women to get evidence out of them. This is right at the beginning. This is in the 1st decade of the 2nd century. You've got Tacitus, the 2nd decade of the 2nd century, and he talks about how during the time of Nero that he was persecuting multitudes of Christians, executing them by feeding them to wild animals and putting them to all sorts of cruel tortures and executions, crucifying them and then lighting them up on their crosses at night. In the year 150, you've got Justin Martyr, around the year 150, the middle of the 2nd century. And he wrote to the Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, and tried to persuade him to stop executing Christians. And then Tertullian at the beginning of the 3rd century, end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century, he's talking about how the blood of the Christian martyrs is becoming the seed of the church. So they're still killing Christians, martyring Christians at the beginning of the 3rd century. And it goes on and on from there. You had Origen, who in the early part of the 3rd century, he was put into prison and tortured by the Romans. So brutally that when he was let out within 18 months, he died. You've got the account of the martyrdom of Polycarp, who knew the Apostle John. And we've got that. You've got Ignatius, who's writing 6 letters to various churches and to Polycarp en route to his execution in Rome. There's just so much evidence out there of the Romans executing Christians. There's just nothing out there to say that Josephus was colluding with the Romans to come up with something to make up this stuff about the Christians.
Yeah, we hear weird things, but still, these are the most popular among the non-scholar circles. And I think that the last question is more into a biblical question, still regarding the crucifixion and the resurrection. But some of the people think that there are it's different accounts in the Bible, inside the Bible, that make the story a little bit haphazard. Like there is no order in the story. Everyone is writing something different or writing his own perspective, which make us doubt about that. I think this is more biblical question more than historical. But what is your comment on that?
Well, that's not unique to the Bible. So you don't have that with the Quran because you only have the one book, right?
Yes.
So I guess you get the closest you get is, where the Quran says something in one text and something different in another, because it's the first thing has been abrogated.
Yeah.
But Here you've got 4 different accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and some of the details are different. All right. Now there's different ways of explaining that. Memory can be different. Now, memory, you can have differences in details, but the gist is usually recalled, with extreme accuracy. I mean, if you saw someone raised from the dead, you'd remember that for the rest of your life. If you saw someone walk on water, you would remember that for the rest of your life. Maybe you wouldn't remember a minor detail, such as where exactly you were coming from, or where you were going, or what night it was. You might confuse it with something else, but you're still going to remember, hey, he walked on water, and this is how he felt when we saw it. Or he gave sight to a person who was born blind, or he healed a paralytic, or raised a dead person. You're going to remember those kinds of things. There's also what we call compositional devices that were part and parcel of how ancient authors were taught to bury details through paraphrasing and abbreviating or simplifying a text. A lot of the same kind of things that we do today in our ordinary everyday conversations. But let's say you do have some discrepancies in the minor details in the Gospels. These are no different than what you find in different parallel accounts of other things. So, for example, we've got multiple accounts of the assassination of Caesar and what happened. Plutarch himself reports it on 4 different occasions, details in 3 of those occasions. And you have differences in the way, discrepancies of minor details in the way Plutarch reports it in those 3 accounts. But it's also reported by Appian, by Cicero, Dio, Livy, Nicolaus, Suetonius, and Velleius, in addition to Plutarch. And when you look at the differences, it's like, wow, you got a lot. So like in one of the accounts, it was Trebonius, one of the conspirators who restrained Antony from going, into the room where Caesar was going to be assassinated, so he wouldn't intervene while the conspirators did their thing. So one account says it was Trebonius. Another account says it was D. Brutus Albinus. That's different than Marcus Brutus, who was one of the actual assassins. D. Brutus Albinus, that he held him out. I think there's a simple explanation for that, but you've got these discrepancies in details and what the person said and exactly where they struck Caesar first and what Caesar said. When he got the first stab, we don't turn around and say, well, I guess Caesar wasn't assassinated. We just say, that there's some discrepancies in minor details. At the very most, you could say that the Gospels, because of that, are not divinely inspired if you take a certain rigid view of what divine inspiration has to look like. But you wouldn't say that the accounts aren't credible at that point, any more than you would say the accounts of Caesar's assassination aren't credible because they have differences in minor details. So I think people make too much out of these differences in the details. If you look at the Gospels only as historical sources, rather than trying to take a rigid wooden Quranic view of how divine inspiration works, like through divine dictation, which is not how Christians think the Bible was divinely inspired, then you're judging them according to something that has never been claimed, that the Bible was divinely dictated, that it just can't be the case, that's the way inspiration took place, because you've got different education levels and writing styles between these Gospels that is readily seen when you really study them. And there's so many reasons for showing that or believing that it's not divine dictation involved. We believe it's divinely inspired, but not through dictation. And maybe
also the idea that the writers have also different styles also make a lot of differences in the way we should read the Bible, because up till today, I think people try to compare the Gospels verse by verse to each other, which is, I think, not academically right, because they take it out of context.
Yeah, I've written a book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? It's published by Oxford University Press. And I explain a lot of the reasons, probably most of why there are differences between the Gospels. It's because of these compositional devices that authors were taught to write. And if someone wants to say, yeah, but the Gospel authors were Aramaic speaking, at least Matthew and John, Aramaic speaking Jews who were probably illiterate. Matthew may not have been totally illiterate, but you don't have to be,
not a physician,
greatly literate to do taxes back then. You just had to be able to write a little bit. Yeah. So how is it that they could? Well, that's easy. They used what were called an amanuensis, or a secretary, to help them do it. And so they would take and tell the secretary different stories and what Jesus said, and the secretary would take notes, and then the secretary would compose that. And then the person would look at it or have it read to them and sign off on it if they agreed with it. Look, Cicero did this, and he was one of the most highly educated people in Rome. He had a secretary, an amanuensis named Tiro. And one time, and he wrote to Tiro when Tiro, I believe he was recovering from an illness, and he said, hey, Tiro, Pompey has been staying over with me at my house. And the other night he asked me to read something I had written, and I refused because I said, without Tiro, I am altogether dumb. So that's Cicero saying that Tiro made him take his writings and made him look really good. Paul, he had in at least 3 of his letters, he says, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand, which means he didn't write the rest. We say, well, maybe that secretary took dictation. Well, maybe. But then in Romans, which is the crown literary jewel of all of Paul's letters, in chapter 16, verse 22, it says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. So the secretary actually names himself, provides his name there. So we can bet that he just took notes from Paul, and then Tertius composed the letter that we call Romans, and Paul signed off on it after he read it and agreed to it. So, but it's Pauline thought and everything. So I don't see any problem with that. This whole thing about gospel differences is not a problem. And
we don't think also that they may die for something that they are not sure of 100%. Well, well, I wouldn't say 100%. I mean, if you saw the guy raised from the dead, you're going to be 100%, right? But I mean, even Christians today, and even Muslims today, who die in jihad, or even people of other worldviews who die for their causes, they die because they believe that cause is true. Well, they're not 100% sure, based on data, but they are confident enough that they're willing to die for it. But the disciples, on the other hand, we've got evidence that all of them suffered continuously for their gospel proclamation, and all were willing to go to their deaths. We don't know if all of them did. We know that several of them did, like Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. They were willing to. I think we could add a few more to that, and it could be that all of them were. It's just some of them are reported later, and we're just not certain about those. And we've got good evidence for several of them. And we can be certain that at least they didn't make it up.
That's right. They sincerely believed what they were proclaiming is true. And look, Thomas, there is a big difference between the apostles dying for what they believed to be true and us as Christians, our willingness to be persecuted and die for what we believe to be true. We are believing based on the testimony of others and our personal experience, okay? But the disciples were willing to suffer and willing to die for something they knew was true or knew was false. They knew whether Jesus had actually been raised from the dead and appeared to them. And it's like, really, what are the chances that all of these guys, maybe 1 or 2 of them, but all of them willing to suffer continuously and willing to die for something they knew was false? That just doesn't make sense. So that's why the majority of critical scholars, virtually all critical scholars who write on the subject today, agree that Jesus' disciples not only proclaimed that he rose and had appeared to them, they actually believed it.
Amen. Mike, time with you just fly like always. Every time, my brother, time flies. But before we close, I want to take the chance for two advices. What would you say to our Muslim brothers today in the Arab world? And the second, what would you say to Christian youth today who doubt their faith or started to feel not so much comfortable in it?
Well, to our Muslim friends, and I really mean that as friends, I have Muslims who are friends. To my Muslim friends, I would say, look, I understand that if you've been brought up in the religion of Islam, it is difficult to overcome one's bias. I wrestled tremendously with my biases for Christianity when I was doing my investigation for the resurrection of Jesus. And even as I study scripture, the Gospels, and comment on different things, like on gospel differences, there's a lot of my very conservative Christian brothers and sisters who don't like how I look at gospel differences or how I view certain things in the New Testament. And I've been ostracized from some places because they disagree with me on this. But I try to be as honest as I can in my research. Why? Because we don't have to fear truth. And what we have to fear is that our biases will get in the way so much that they prevent us from discovering truth, and it costs us eternity. I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want it to happen to you, of course. And I know you don't want it to happen to you. Yes. So just look at the stuff, look at the evidence, and try to look at it as objectively as possible, and pray and ask God. I did this for years when I was doing my doctoral research. God, if this is true, please show me. Please show me if it's true. I don't care if you have to embarrass me. Just show me that it's true, because I want to follow truth. So pray. God will know if you're serious in your prayer and in your efforts to look at the truth. That's what I would encourage you to do, and keep seeking. For my Christian brothers and sisters out there who are like college students, high school students, and struggling with this, I'd say, look, the evidence is there. And I understand if you're living in the Arab world, it is tough for you right now because there is persecution. But be encouraged, because Christians have been persecuted and pressured from its very earliest days. They pressured and persecuted Jesus, and they did his disciples. And he said, look, if the world hates me, they're going to hate you too. If it persecutes me, it's going to persecute you. We should expect persecution. But this life is just temporal. It is temporary. So hang in there, because being a Christian and knowing God is a wonderful thing, and he'll be with you. And eternal life is what matters more than life on this earth. So hang in there and stay close to Jesus. Read the scriptures, pray. And if you're on a college campus, be certain to hang out with as many other Christians, like-minded believers as possible, because you need the fellowship. We need Christian fellowship, especially in cultures where we are being persecuted.
Mike, I cannot thank you enough for everything, and I hope that we can be greedy to take a promise that it will not be the last time that we may do other stuff, because people are thirsty for more knowledge and more deep of the truth. And I have fantastic news for people. Mike Lickona page now is in Arabic. So this is very important news. And we hope that a lot of articles and every video will be there translated, and you will have access to it. So thank you, Mike. Thank you for caring to reach out to my people. This means a lot to us, brother. This means a lot to us. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome, Thomas, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate you, brother, and I appreciate your ministry, and I'll be happy to come on again in the future.
Thank you so much. May God bless you. May God bless your ministry, and see you again very soon on another episode.
Thank you, brother.